Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
There were often old women standing along the curb, laying out on the surface of oilcloth, jackets, or plates brought from home, some items for sale. Here it was possible to see all sorts of things. Of course, more often brought something ordinary: books, an old telephone, cups, and so-called crystal. In fact, it is a popular imitation of crystal, which was often put in the cupboards as a sign of wealth and almost never taken out for a feast. Salad bowls were at most left in glass cabinets and filled with candy. Jam and snack bowls were filled with documents, some important papers, passes, or something similar. These items, it was as if they were squeezing out of themselves the little exuberance left over from the times when there was enough money to buy any surplus, saying that they had a long and happy, pleasant life that did not require hoarding and saving. A life when there is an opportunity to fill one's household with something pleasant, some aesthetics and richness. Many old ladies now looked at the world with a gaze full of fear and longing. Every customer who could potentially purchase an item became a piece of hope. An amazing opportunity to get a little bit of that chewy component of the world that makes it possible to pay the bills, that component called money, and is as important to the social body as blood is to the human body. Money is necessary for exchange, but the old ladies had nothing to exchange. Nor could they change anything about their own situation. They used to exchange their time and their energy of strength for money, worked and drained their own time, got money at work. In this way they helped their families, arranged their everyday life, and sometimes they could buy themselves some happiness and joy. Some pleasant moments, like going to a coastal resort and securing for themselves the kind of lifestyle that is normal and customary for wealthy people, but becomes something rare and exotic for people of working class backgrounds who spend the rest of their lives squeezing the life out of themselves, giving up their time to get some money in exchange and buy what they need to exist in this world. When Casey walked by these old ladies, she didn't look into their eyes and especially didn't scrutinize the goods on offer, which were often set up in front of each, sprawled out at the counter, to be scrutinized by the passersby, the hipsters. Probably at these moments they felt like visitors of a fashionable European blissful market or something similar. It seemed to Casey that every curious question such guys asked the old ladies literally wounded them, and it was as if they were leaking some invisible and painful blood. Casey herself felt heavy as she walked by. She hardly ever looked at the old ladies. Some of them would say something in a dull and slightly squeaky voice. The exact words were particularly hard to make out. It sounded something like UPI, or here you go, or some other phrases expressing a modest hope that she would become a shopkeeper and be able to give a little money, on which they would eat or drink cheap liquor for their elderly husbands or negligent sons. Not everyone came to trade of her own free will, and they certainly didn't trade for the good life. Casey knew that, but she knew she couldn't spend the extra money. She had never pondered in such a way that she had a daughter and needed it more. She never thought in those categories that someone needed more and someone didn't. She only realized that she couldn't buy anything. She just couldn't. And if she could, she would certainly buy something. As she walked by, Casey didn't look at those sheets of cheap junk, books, and rare shiny costume jewelry. As she approached, she always felt a sharp squeeze somewhere in the middle of her chest. Not painful, but somehow incredibly precisely perceptible. The clenching drew her attention, and there was nothing she could do about it. It was as if the entire volume of sadness that these old women had once felt was at once located in her chest and not expanding, but instead shrinking and concentrating into something incredibly real and tangible. Moreover, not physical in the literal sense of the word, but an experience as if it were somehow real and non-existent. Perhaps similar are feelings from a dream or in a dream that are real, but arise out of illusion and are themselves largely illusory. Nevertheless, if someone were to ask Casey what the most real of what she felt in this world was, she would call it the tightness inside her chest, a feeling like opening pieces of wet absorbent cotton in pieces where each tearing fiber has a greater sensitivity. She would say that these feelings were as unreal as the joy and serenity she felt when she met her spouse, or as the rare thoughts of something beautiful, sometimes perhaps almost everyone manages to discover in his mind and marvel at the harmony of this world. That being said, Casey did not suffer from the way her compassion manifested itself, though maybe that wasn't the most accurate word for her feelings for old ladies. She didn't have the sense of morbidity that is often associated with rejection or fear that some unpleasant experience will reappear. Nevertheless, every time she walked by them, she felt what in the commonplace language of popular phrases is called heart bleeding. Nor did Casey take any pleasure in these experiences. For example, regarding the fact that she still lives better and does not have to stand every day with a begging look. Though it had to be admitted that every day at work was a lot like that kind of traffic porch. Not literally, but in essence. I also had to worry, fear, and realize that money is needed and no one will help. And only the one who gives money, the employer, can somehow improve the very meager life. Casey had a position at the railroad station in her town. The town was small, and so was the station. She had once joked that something nice would happen to her, and she would go to the metropolis as the station keeper's daughter. But the city wouldn't let her go, and she didn't really want to leave. One day she met a good man, by the way, at the very station at work, where he came to change the wiring and do some other electrical work. But it turned out that it wasn't just the wiring that was sparkling, but Casey herself, who saw a very young guy named Joe. He somehow looked incredibly organic in his electrician's uniform, and he seemed to be more of an unusual worker and some kind of hidden wizard who not only knows how to ensure the work of lights and various devices, but as if able to listen to every building, to understand its problems, and sometimes to walk beside some person and make his world a little better. This happened then in everyday life. For example, crying children near him stopped screaming, cranky older children stopped being cranky in the store. Sad people often lifted their heads and began to look around confidently. It was as if Joe had a knack for somehow changing the moods of others, or had something that could be encouraging and inspiring. Though by everyday standards he had nothing that special and did nothing special. Sure, he was a good electrician, but clearly not outstanding. And there were quite a few such specialists even in their town. That is, if the city was left without such an electrician, it would not be especially poor. But when the town was left without Joe as a man who had an invisible skill, the town became impoverished, as well as Cassie herself felt that something was now missing. Casey imagined that Joe did have some sort of ability to set things right in this world. Oh, and he didn't look like an ordinary laborer. For some reason, he was always that status, decked out in uniform, handsome with a bag for tools and other items. He also used really good pens. Casey had found that out when Joe was required to sign some paperwork on a job that had been done. Details like that about him were attractive and created mystery. He didn't look rich, not some kind of luxury, not at all. He looked exactly special, somehow rare and different. As she found out later, he was like that. And he had left this world too, probably because he was so special. But Casey tried not to think about those details. She sat and thought about it, and automatically filled out the reports she knew so well that she could sometimes detect inaccuracies only by glancing at the surface of the printed files. Outside the window the trains were rumbling, and Lucy, a work friend from the neighboring office, came into the office. Lucy, who loved to chat with Casey, to talk about her family and other affairs about events. Now she chattered on and on about the big curved screen TV they'd bought for the house and organized almost every day, screening night, to choose directors for the retrospective and watch all their pictures in full in a few days. Unless, of course, the directors have made too many films in their careers. You know, I started to look at Friedkin in a completely different way, Lucy said. At first I thought it was totally entertaining and unassuming, but then I started to recognize what a great artist he was after all. And the most important thing is, you know what? Casey nodded, staying bent over the papers. She wanted to finish the reports. The most important thing, as I found out. Lucy looked at her friend on the other side of the table with an inspired look. The end of the Earth's journey. That's how Friedkin ended his life. How was it? Continuing to nod, CECI lifted her head slightly and smiled, so her friend wouldn't feel awkward. You talk. I just see they're finishing up here. He's the one who predicted it. Lucy pushed herself up in her chair and grasped the table with both hands. Look, the most famous movie ever made, or one of the most famous movies. Kalina Krasnaya at our house. Recently there was a retrospective of Friedkin's movies, a family viewing. We got together and watched it. And you know, I'll tell you, on such a screen and with such sound it looks completely different. Casey looked up and nodded at Lucy. Well, it's not about that, it's about freaking. Lucy wondered how she hadn't discovered the magical world of cinema earlier, and now she realized how valuable TV was. He starred in Kalina. Why? To get another movie to make a serious movie about Jacob's rebellion. But how could they just give him a movie like that? And it's about Jacob and the rebellion. So they say they took him out in the end. And they left a trail, or rather he left a trail. But not the way he wanted, but the way they wanted him. Lucy was meaningfully silent, correcting herself a little in her chair. She looked out of the window, and then raised her finger up and said, "Wanted, you know?" Casey nodded. So, moreover, Lucy herself began to ponder who she meant when she so meaningfully raised her index finger to the ceiling of the station, consisting of a panel and a small hole, which used to be more often used for budget interiors. The movie itself, the plot itself, on the one hand, then there was the idea that it was possible to re-educate convicts. I watched a program about it, and here they gave such a task to make a movie that shows how society and good human attitude make a convict a human being, like labor from a monkey in general. Everyone was disappointed in it, and crime didn't disappear, and the convicts remained convicts as well. But look at another level of the movie. In the story, the main character wants to free himself from his old company. He wants to do something different. Basically, work for people honestly. In the end, his old associates catch up with him, suspect him of something and kill him and bury him. The freakin' himself was also stabbed on a steamship during a cruise. And somehow it's so strange, without serious proceedings, and for some reason they didn't start to create resonance. After all, he starred in this movie Kalina Red and had to start about Jacob, his own movie to do, not which by decree asked to do, and which he himself came up with. And some people think that they didn't let him do it, so that he wouldn't tell people too much, so that he wouldn't inadvertently incite a riot. Lucy again meaningfully silent and began to look into space, feeling her unity with the fate of the artist, the fate of the people, and the masterpieces of world culture, which can now enjoy almost every evening on a big screen with sound, as in the movie theater. Only she buys popcorn on the way to the store, heats up 2 4-packs for everyone, and does not need to overpay. Or here. She continued, Korean movies. I used to watch mostly dramas when TV was smaller, and this is where we started. But I told you to watch movies from different directors. Now I'm watching, and sometimes I choose Korean movies alone. It's very interesting. Kim Ka-duk, for example. Such poignant pictures. And everything can be so dreary. And yet, yeah, that's life. Have you seen Vermin? Casey waved her head. You should check it out. Yeah, I don't really have time. Casey said, I'm working with my daughter tonight, or I'm doing reports. Well, you two should watch it. Lucy insisted. We've been watching everything too. And it's all about family, but it's more of a bad example. Not people like us, more selfish, I guess. Lucy thought again and looked out into space, and as if she were looking a little through Casey to the wall behind her. She could see her body leaning over the desk a little blurred, and there was a little halo or glow around the perimeter that was like the halo from the light fixtures in the ceiling of the offices. This is a serious topic, social stratification. Lucy began to speak not as fast as she had before. Apparently, she told the main set of her news, which included the main one about the big screen and its advantages, and an additional story about her own spiritual and cultural enrichment and her experiences with the fate of artists. The director of these parasites was also from a poor family, and they have a strictly whoever rich earns more, the poor remain that way. Isn't it like that everywhere? In our country, for example, I couldn't have imagined it 10 years ago. Casey, that we have such a TV set and we could watch such a movie. And now we didn't buy a TV for nothing, and it's almost worth a paycheck. And before that, who prevented you from watching a good movie? I didn't, but it's not the same, That's not the point. You asked about wealth. This is wealth. TV in every sense. Casey nodded. Don't you want to hear more about the parasites? Sure, go ahead. Don't mind me. I just need to finish this. See there. Lucy stayed in her office for another half hour or so, even though she was going to leave earlier. Casey had almost finished the reports, and so sometimes she would be distracted by her to say something or listen to another passage about a fashion director. For example, about how Rocky talked about the ordinariness of human existence and yet was able to evoke such sharp feelings and discover the essence of relationships. Casey looked outside the window. With Lucy's departure, daylight had gone too. She listened to the rest of her stories in the twilight of the fall evening. Darkness was starting earlier now and loomed with the strict outline of the boundary between light and darkness. The station office building was well lit, seemed warm and clear. But at the same time there was a feeling not only of legal through signs and darkness, but also that the building itself was somehow shining too boldly when darkness was already spreading through all the streets. So it shines as if it's not supposed to. Everything is supposed to be dark and not stand out. So sometimes it felt a little dangerous to be a part of this sacred building. Therefore, when Casey went on the road from work on such blue evenings, as if merged from the darkness of the streets, she tried at once to become inconspicuous and not to stand out. Thanks to this, there was a kind of peace and an opportunity to observe the outside world more thoughtfully. Getting off the bus, she kept thinking about the conversation with the entourage. It was also appropriate to ask the conductor. So, unpleasant. The thoughts themselves were unpleasant and disturbing. Casey thought about what she could buy her daughter and herself, a big TV, so that they could watch something in the evenings. In her mind, Casey realized that sometimes they could go to the movies, and a laptop computer opened up the possibility of watching almost the entire volume of film movies, and sometimes it was good to read a book. Except that she understood these details in her mind, and in her emotions there were a lot of options of a big TV, all sorts of smart functions, which seemed to be an integral part of something important, some important component of life, of which you are definitely considered poor. And that's fine, you don't seem to be living. But if there are these features and a big screen. Casey was hard at work counting the money she would have to save and saw a very distant prospect, like a fairyland. Behind a set of hills, where there is a magic palace, a TV set, the inhabitants of which she can become, if she passes all the difficulties and trials on the way, on the curves of these giant hills. And the hills were indeed huge. And to contemplate the possibility of conquering such a path was no less ambitious than to contemplate in all seriousness a journey on foot, say, to another city. Walking beside the old ladies who had set up their curbside porch, she again experienced the familiar feeling of her heart being torn by wet absorbent cotton and tried not to look at the old ladies. But this vague averting of her gaze could in no way forbid her to feel. Her feelings were united with her own thoughts about the big screens, which are becoming synonymous with great joy and dreams. And to calm a little the sudden rush of feelings, which almost forced her to scream, she shifted her gaze over the old women's heads wrapped in painted shawls, the color of the holy domes. Above, beyond the fence and the construction site, a little farther away the dome of a new religion could be seen, a rectangular glow of brand logos of mall office brands. Casey thought that the old ladies were really, in a sense, standing in the porch at the temple. Only at the new temple of the consumer society, and they're asking for favors through the ridiculous sale of some items needed except by tipsy passersby or mockingly hipsters. Seems very symbolic. The apple tree. With a squeaky voice, an old woman familiar to Casey stretched out. To be more precise, Casey, as usual, didn't quite hear or make out those words. It sounded like apples or apple trees or something. But there were so many hidden meanings in that squeaky sound. A whole story about how the old woman was having a hard time every day, how scary, sometimes badly from lack of food, how the thought of death, as frightening and cold as current life, was scraping at her sharp claw that wasn't really understood, whether it was hearing this single set of creaking sounds or a whole long story with lamentations and old woman's tears that rarely washed over the parched beds of deep wrinkles on her cheeks. Take it, please. Casey quickly pulled the entire wad of money out of the wallet lying in the side compartment. She placed the bags in the half-open palm of the fine china and quickly moved on. That the old woman might not be able to object to anything, and that she might not hear her words at all, and that she didn't want to admit to herself. To get through this part of the journey a little faster, because there were too many different feelings mixed up in it. The thoughts on the bus made her feel so uncomfortable, and she wanted to do something really meaningful, not to be remembered or repaid or praised, just to make an impact on the world, to be able to make someone happy and to know that she wasn't stuck in her hopelessness and isolation, that she could help. That being said, she didn't think that her help would change anything. This old lady would also continue to be troubled by a drinking spouse or son, or she would continue to give most of her money for rent and medications that needed to be bought regularly. Either way, she realized that she had no way to make a drastic difference, and the old lady would also continue to stand there, going about her poor business. But for a while, she would become more pleasant. She would have less worries. And that's where the help comes in. Casey would make her existence less dreadful. That was the point. Beyond that, Casey saw it as something more important than the standard female freak out and buy. Sure, she could splurge on something important for her daughter and herself, after all, take out some kind of loan for a big TV and pay the down payment. But she also wanted to make a gesture that was not typical for her and let her get out of her daily ennui. And not just to her, but to another person. Nanny was doing her homework. She sat bent over a desk with a large lamp that gave off a nice warm light. "How's school going?" Recognized Casey, peeking in on her. "Same as always." "What's that?" "The usual bad or the usual good." "Same as always, everyone's," Nanny answered, lifting her head from her notebooks. "Lessons, recess, sometimes you get to eat." "Have you eaten, by the way?" Casey asked. "Yeah, I had burgers and mashed potatoes, but it was rock solid, the kind you could put caulk in the windows." "Did you eat your afternoon snack? I gave you money." "Yes, but the girls and I went for a walk, and then we went to the cafeteria. You know, the cheap one where Nancy's grandfather works." "Oh, so you ate there?" We ate. "Anyway, I'm here to write a paper, and you're interrogating me." "It's not interrogations. How do you even talk to your mother?" Casey smiled. "Very respectful." Nanny smiled back and leaned over her notebook again. Casey went to her room and caught the slightly embarrassing thought in her mind that she would now wait to see if Nanny would be asked to eat. She might not want to, but if she did, there was nothing to cook but vermicelli, and even then there wasn't much left in a couple of packets. And there were still a lot of days left before the paycheck. She had no idea what to feed her daughter. She only imagined shameful attempts to think of something. Her eyes were slipping under these thoughts, saturated with worries, and the working day was tiring. But at the same time, she was worried about worries of quite essential domestic character. What to eat? Nanny still had her school lunches paid for. And there was probably some money left over that she could eat with during the day, but taking money from her or sending her to the store herself was not at all acceptable. Usually Casey would go to the store in the evening and buy some of the goodies she needed for the evening. A main course or pasta. She couldn't spend all the money from her paycheck at once to be able to spend on unexpected expenses, and she tried to cook quite frugally but inventively. As practice showed, as she bought more, the food was eaten faster, and sometimes it was a little short of her paycheck. Then she borrowed from the station master or Lucy. Maybe Lucy could borrow, Casey thought. Listening in a half-sleep to the hypnotic tunes of news and soap operas, she remembered at once that she had listened to her all evening only to be reminded of a few dollars she had borrowed earlier and was going to pay back from the bonus they usually gave her closer to winter. Casey imagined Lucy now sitting also in front of the screen light, but this light is better and more expensive and probably more pleasant, sitting and not thinking about money and finding food. Because Lucy's spouse makes good money and they can afford to study Korean directors. Casey felt no envy or resentment. Only the occasional fear about Nani, who might be hungry, crept through time. And even more disconcerting to Casey was the thought of wishing that somehow Nanny wouldn't want to eat, to somehow get through this evening, to somehow survive. Casey pulled the comforter over herself and stretched out on the couch. The lights were off, only the screen illuminating the room with stories of other worlds and destinies, an overcast sky and a pleasant heat. Casey had been watching some educational program about shrimp in the evening and for some reason had been particularly amazed that shrimp had hearts in their heads. Then there was also, I think, a dream about shrimp, or something about shrimp. Either she was eating them, which was entirely possible given her empty stomach, or she was catching them and releasing them, or talking to someone about them. The thought was so with Casey, and rising on a fresh sheet, she continued to ponder that image. Nanny was still asleep. She wanted to get some time off to walk around, and so she had an essay to do until tonight. That's probably why she didn't come to me and didn't ask for food, so she'd be sure to get an excuse, Casey thought and shook her head. She felt especially nice and refreshed somehow. The lack of satiety gave clarity of thought. And so like the sky, the color of a pre-rain cloud, which offset the many hues in it and gave a sense of fundamental peace and clarity. The clouds didn't run and hardly moved at all. They were static. There was no excessive light or similar clutter. On days like this, it was nice to reflect on something leisurely grinding coffee and also leisurely boiling it in the turbo. walking nearby and doing small household chores, thinking about work matters and weekday plans. Frankly, shrimp have such hearts in their heads, Casey thought, stamping her words oddly, trying to detect any additional meanings in that she did. That is, they probably both think and feel, at least symbolically. Maybe that's why they have such clear and understanding eyes. Casey remembered how she had once eaten shrimp in one of the best restaurants in the city at a corporate party. And in addition to realizing that she really wanted to eat a large fried shrimp right there, she realized that even then she had thought how cute and delicate these shrimp were. Eyes without shells, without eyelids or pupils, and yet they look as if they understand. Maybe that's their reward. Casey continued to ponder if they were so small and defenseless, and they were being fished out with nets and having their tiny legs torn off, their fragile exoskeletons ripped apart, having everything that made up their lives picked out with one finger. Maybe that's why they have a heart in their head, or a head in their heart? What, in fact, is the difference? Maybe they once understood and realized their plight and decided that only realizing this harsh reality was too hard, and it would be nice to at least feel more of this world, to somehow attach feelings to the mind, so that thoughts would not be so confusing and oppressive. Then they became like that, and now they look so understanding and without evil eyes. Casey remembered a frame from some popular cartoon she had recently watched. There was a shrimp too, looking pitifully into the frame. Casey went to wake Nani up. They were having a morning cartoon session, watching the wonders of the stock markets, a rather old American cartoon that Casey remembered from her childhood. Casey wasn't against anything foreign and didn't have such strict judgments or prejudices, but made sure Nani didn't watch popular bloggers and some modern cartoons and movies. Still, really mass and popular culture used to be better somehow. At least when she showed cartoons or some funny comedies of her childhood to Nani, she reasonably remarked that nowadays such things are not filmed, or at least they are not in the trends. In general, Nani was not particularly resistant to some restrictions on the internet and watching modern content. Of course, she may have watched something with her girlfriends or at recess, but she wasn't particularly drawn to it, and the sweetness of something forbidden certainly didn't appeal to her. Casey had once told me that watching cartoons used to require getting up at some time or rushing home from school, and that TV was the only option to watch funny cartoons that were so entertaining. So they decided to do something similar and have their own cartoon sessions on weekends. The point was that a schedule was also required, and Casey made sure the schedule was followed. If they were late, they weren't watching from the beginning. Though, of course, for the most part, having a schedule only made it fun and allowed them to gather on a free day under a cozy blanket or on the couch with a laptop, and pleasantly tucked away mixed with images of still warm dreams. Watching a couple episodes of cartoons with just the two of us. It was so cozy, sometimes not even to wash, just a little doused and hurried to watch in the sleep, knowing that further free day and no need to hurry, especially that things are somewhere far away. And now waiting for an exciting plot and new stories about the adventures of the main characters, dragons and dungeon bears, or other popular stories. Casey reflected as she walked that she had never thought to tell anyone about these sit-downs with Nani. She had even, on the contrary, somehow unconsciously realized that this was their only intimate and non-tellable experience. Interesting, she thought, how many pleasant emotions, if indeed such a thing can be measured, do we experience when we watch cartoons? And Lucy and hers when she watches the next movie or trendy show. Casey thought it would be really curious to find out. After all, it was quite possible Lucy had decided to tell her about it in some detailed episodes to gain a little on the side of pleasantries. Maybe if she tells, if someone else is amazed for her and will think that she is actually rejoicing in these moments, and will also want the same kind of experiences, then there will also be a lot of joy in her social life. If she will begin to envy a little each something to her own, in the family of children to the spouse on big TV prosperity, then some real sense of joy would come into Lucy's life too, because everyone else would assume she was joyful. Casey thought about it and realized how ridiculous it was. She had just recently been thinking about that big screen and adding up the salaries to calculate when she would be able to make Nani happy with such a huge television. And she was now realizing that it was like she didn't know about their cartoon session. These sessions had been such a natural part of their interactions that she hadn't given it a second thought. And now for some reason she saw how much intimacy and joy they had in it. And that amazingly, when they watched cartoons, it was as if they disappeared from all problems. Only this part of life was so natural, like a part of themselves that you don't think about. Outside the window were painted watercolors, overcast clouds, watery spread with soft hues across the sky. The nightingale bells sounded unexpectedly, and Casey thought it strange to hear such a thing. First, she went to Nanny's room and told her to go watch without her, to turn on new episodes they hadn't watched yet. Afterward, she went to the door and peered through the gap bridged by the short door chain. Saw a porcelain, slightly trembling palm, as if the TV screen was slightly reblinking the image. How almost transparent and thin that palm was, and such an imperceptible tremor incessantly gave a slight twitch. Casey looked up and saw the old lady from yesterday. The town was small, and generally everyone knew each other, just didn't socialize. There were separate groups. In general, of course, everyone went to the same schools and went to the same stores. There were well-known characters. Almost everyone knew everyone else through one or two handshakes. Some saw each other on their way to and from work or in other typical settings. Beyond that, social media brought people together and allowed them to get to know each other. Although the looseness in the comments of groups typical and similar did not extend beyond the virtual space. In the real space there were still virtual, but at the same time quite real borders adjacent to the meridian of social statuses and attitudes. Even if city dwellers, who had been actively discussing a common city problem in comments, sought each other in the afternoon on the street or in the queue of a store, they rarely continued the discussion. At most, they could briefly say hello or nod to each other. And that was rare. Mostly they could only look at each other. But in the evening in the comments, they could easily continue their conversation. Either the real reality seemed too serious to talk about something, or it seemed indecent and embarrassing. Be that as it may, at that, many people knew each other, and Casey also knew this old lady roughly what houses she was from, who her acquaintances were, and the like. But she was not thinking about that, but about the fact that the old woman had decided to find her and return the money, a rather large sum for their wealth. And now she would have to listen to something like that, and so uncomfortable, and the problem was that Casey was a little and wanted the money back. After all, if they didn't, then when Nanny went out and asked for money, she would have to refuse and say something like, "I gave it to you and you spent it all." And then develop a little constructive speech about the value of money and attitudes towards it, not really to teach Nanny how to handle money, but to cover up the shameful need and lack of money. Casey was worried about having to figure out something to eat, look for some opportunities, and wait until the beginning of the week for something to break even at work. Casey looked up and realized that on the one hand, she didn't want the old woman to tell her anything. She would have to give her something to drink and talk about, because there was nothing to give her besides talking. And on the other hand, she wanted to take the money, to leave her ride of generosity in the previous day and to get under the plaid with Nani, and go to the store in peace in the afternoon. That said, what Casey disliked most of all was that these thoughts were occurring to her, and she wasn't particularly resisting it or considering the possibility at all. Casey began longingly and a little creakily, but not so wistfully, the old woman. "Open up, child, and see what news I have for you. The Lord sent my thanks and I thought of you at once." In her other hand, the old woman held a freshly bought cake. Next to her stood a young man about Casey's age, but with a slightly strange look, and behind his back, he had a large hiking backpack in his left hand. Another more fashionable and youthful urban-type backpack, with a long stick of sausage peeking out of it and more food visible in an unzipped compartment, which could also be detected by the bulging contours of the body itself. What was strange, however, was not his luggage, but the sort of entourage that peered invisibly into this appearance. It was like a freshly laid fancy tile, so clean, a little shiny, smelling pleasantly of cleanliness and some freshness, of a job well done, of good tools and technology, strong and reliable tile glue on which they lay squares of such tiles. Accept the benefactress. Do not be sorry that so not unexpected. Now I'll tell you what's what. The old lady went on. "Rocky," said the young man and held out his hand. "Probably a new friend of yours." He spoke with a noticeable accent, but without any serious phonetic distortions. Casey skipped across the threshold and said hello. She wasn't superstitious, but such small details were somehow always honored. She touched the old woman's shoulder, told her to pass. The three of them ended up in the hallway. Casey was working on the chain and the lock. The young man modestly, delicately set his luggage aside and gracefully helped the old lady remove and hang her cloth, coat, and even helped her take off her boots on the closet hook. "Now just a second," said Casey and went over to Nani. "You watch without me. What's the matter? Who's here?" "An acquaintance, or rather acquaintances. Anyway, you watch or you're gonna miss it. Okay. Is everything okay?" "Yeah, Nani, it's fine. We'll talk, and I'll come to you." Casey closed the glass-enclosed door and went to arrange the unexpected delegation at the kitchen table. She called Nani affectionately Cusie. Casey seated the new arrivals at the kitchen table and began brewing cocoa. In fact, she had nothing else, but she reasoned that only cocoa should be drunk on blue evenings. "You remember Casey, your namesake, don't you? She used to be a janitor at your station, didn't she?" "Yeah, she used to live next door. Then her son or one of her relatives took her away and they moved." Rocky watched the old lady's story with deep interest and sometimes nodded with a slight tilt of his head. "So that's how Casey knew your aunt?" "She was, yes," Casey answered. "That's how I know you. My name's Lily. Your Aunt Casey and I used to talk a lot. Before Tony got drunk." The old lady went on and waved her porcelain palm, like a cloud passing through the air. "I don't know what to say. Everyone here knows each other." "That's right," Casey remarked, stirring the cocoa in her mugs. She noticed she was starting to use some of that old woman tone, and she thought how sometimes it's who we talk to that makes the difference. Casey handed out the mugs, sat down in the center of the table, and turned to the old woman. She went on with her story. "Everyone knows each other, but not everyone knows about each other. Sometimes they don't know about themselves." The old woman sighed heavily. She moved her cup with one hand and looked at Casey. It was clear that she was not going to drink and wanted to tell something important. "Will you have his cake? Will you have his cake?" asked Cassie to the old woman. "Will you?" Rocky made a facial expression that said that he had no opinion on the matter, as well as in general a little embarrassed, feels in this situation, has no idea what norms of behavior and communication such situations should regulate. Casey stood up abruptly and turned to the table with the cake picked up. She cut the cellophane string and began slicing and arranging the treats. Normally, she would scrupulously untie the wrapping and not throw it away, but use it in her household. But here she realized that if she tightly engaged in such a knot, the old woman would continue to keep silent. An already awkward situation would turn into what Nani calls a cringe. We ourselves don't know how we live and how loved ones live. The old lady still leaned over to the cup a little, sipped a little, raised, took with a coffee spoon the very edge of a piece of cake, put it in her mouth, lived with her front teeth, and smiled a little. Casey thought that this old lady hadn't eaten cake in probably years, and this piece of sweetness was a magical treat for her. The old woman began to talk, and her eyes filled with glistening moisture. She talked long and long. Casey asked polite clarifying questions and realized that she was not the only one who had recently experienced serious nervous overload. Lily talked about the war and how the city was under occupation, and many people didn't evacuate and stay because they said the city would be recaptured quickly and the Germans would be knocked out. She herself was very young and remembers almost nothing, except for a caring aunt who fed and took care of her. Then the aunt disappeared. It wasn't until years later that Lily learned that her aunt had been taken away when the Germans, when they were retreating, had taken her away to work for them. The aunt never came back, and everyone thought she had been killed. Either she died in the camp or something else. "When I took the money from you the other day, I was stunned. I was so worried. I can't catch up with you, my little girl. You're so fast." Now the old woman spoke as if a little tipsy, and even the porcelain of her hand became different, more alive. Casey looked at her with pleasure. She saw the contrast with that usual and familiar look of longing in her eyes and voice. "In our market," the old woman called the row along the curb a market. "It happens that a young man who goes and gives money or a businessman gets out of his car, and there have been times when someone was given a lot of money, but they don't tell others about it. So only if we noticed, we would ask and think about it later. Thanks for taking it," Casey said. "What about it?" the old woman said cheerfully. "It was my first time. I saw that I had hidden the money, and when I came home I was afraid that Tony would drink too much again and would take it away from me. So I sat there almost all night afraid. Tony was there, as usual, making noise, drinking, but he didn't come to me. I guess he still had some." "Is Tony yours?" My son. I raised my grandchildren, but you see how it is with my son. My husband, Harry, when he died, my sweetheart burned to death. He worked all his life, but he only decided to be with me when he lived. And that's the sickness that burned him, honey. I took it well. I've lived a day myself, and it's a holiday." The old woman looked at Cassie with a wise look, and Tony pined, and then he got drunk. He drank it all away. His children are working in the capital, and let them work. And now we're living in a one-room apartment at my place. Why are you like this? You still have a day to live." Casey started out of politeness, but the old woman put her warm white porcelain palm on her hand and stopped these words with a look. "It's not about me, it's about this," she continued. "I heard the doorbell ring this morning. I wondered if it was Tony's friends or you. I'm sorry I thought that, but everything happens for money. It's still scary both ways. Although I think I'll give the money, less to worry, but I don't want to give it to you, dear. You've thought of everything so well. They'll run out of apples by the middle of winter. And what will I sell then? I've picked them over the summer, and all I have to feed myself. I'm just sitting here. I'm afraid I'll have to give the money back or Tony will take it away. But I'm thinking it'd be good for you to get it back. I know about you and Joe. I'm waking up and I'm going to the door myself, so that if Tony's friends come in, I can chase them out so I don't wake him up. And then I see who. Him." She nodded at Rocky. "Actually, my name is Rocky, but I changed it to Rocky myself." The young man had apparently been silent for so long that he wanted to say something. When attention was drawn to him, in addition, it was noticeable how he emphasized the name Rocky. "I see him, and what do you think he's telling me?" Casey noticed that Rocky again did not like the diminutive variant of his name and shrugged her shoulders in bewilderment, as she really had no idea what such a character could do in the early morning in front of the door of a provincial old lady. Though I guessed. The story turned out to be amazing and could well become a plot for a movie by some popular European director. There were in this story and harsh experiences and joys and curious details of surprise and surprises. Nevertheless, life is always far more interesting than movies, and life itself sometimes comes up with stories that are far more entertaining than those of creative authors. Casey listened to this story while watching the shimmering aluminum alloy hues of the clouds from the window. It was like someone actually taking a brush and translucent watercolor, adding water to the paper, blurring the colors of the watercolor, becoming more blurred, curves and patterns appearing. The monochrome gradient makes a kaleidoscope, epic patterns that change incessantly on the wet surface of the firmament. The aunt who took care of Lily when she was just a baby and her parents served days and nights in a defense plant. A German officer liked it. Back then, there was actually a program that basically hijacked mostly women to work in Germany. After that, they could have identified her in various ways, but the officer identified her to her own family. She stayed in Germany, became his wife, and endured with him hardships and joys. They had children, but to come to Britain, although they wanted to, but did not dare. For a former officer, it was difficult, although possible, to organize such a trip. My aunt wanted to, but she realized that they would look at her in different ways, and she could cause problems not only for herself, but also for her family, which, of course, she did not want. So she lived out her days in another country, but in full prosperity and loving family. Seeing her grandchildren, one of whom was Rocky, he was interested in Great Britain from a young age, and his roots even changed his name in memory of one of his ancestors on the British line. Although for Germany, such a name was also quite normal and did not cause any problems. My research relates to the culture of the Midlands of Britain. Rocky began, and it was his turn to continue the story. He spoke with a slight accent, but well enough, which, as it turned out, was later conditioned by the fact that some people in his family still spoke English. I got a serious field research grant and a mission trip in graduate school. Frankly speaking, I was driven not only by the interest of a researcher, but also by the desire to visit here, to see the city of my ancestors. My family, of course, could have provided the trip and everything else, but it is not our custom. Everyone earns money for himself. So I worked hard, got a grant, saved up more money for research and support from sponsors to publish the book. What an amazing plot, Casey said, not imagining how it could help with research into the culture of the Midlands of Britain. The proposition to you is a business one, so to speak. Rocky seemed to sense some confusion and decided to define the details. I need a place to live. Don't be embarrassed, Casey. I thought of you right away. The old woman put a soft, thin hand on her forearm again. You've got a room. You'll need the money. Where can I put my family? Only in the kitchen, but that's where I live." The old woman moved and quietly announced the amount, which was clearly above the average market rent and was probably the gratitude she had extracted for her from her relative. Not one to be shy of funds, not to say that Casey was a stickler for money, but this sum inspired quite a pleasant feeling and would come in handy for her, especially since the roommate was so decent. After that, he informed her that for the most part only overnight lodging was required, and the rest of the time he expected to be on the road, sometimes for a few days, or working from the town library. The apartment left by Joe was really spacious, and the room was spare. Casey had wanted to make a gym or a greenhouse in there, but she'd run out of money or time. And it wasn't like there was a huge need. There were enough things to do and entertain. So the room was empty and only occasionally reminded her of Joe, with whom they slept there. And then Casey moved into the spacious living room, where it was somehow more comfortable now. After eating the second piece of cake, Nanny appeared and said hello to everyone, and Casey invited her to sit down and listen to her about her new roommate. She briefly told her about Rocky. "I try to call him Rocky, although the warm fellowship and close age allowed me to call him Rocky without any familiarity." Afterward, Casey sought Nanny's opinion, assuming that she would most likely agree, which she did. Rocky left the full payment for the first month and went to sort out a large bag. Casey started cooking from the groceries she had brought and sent Nanny out for a walk with a large sum of pocket money. Lily was still sitting at their place. Casey suspected that she didn't want to go to her alcoholic Tony at all and wanted to share with someone else the joy of having a generous and wealthy relative arrive. That the aunt was the person who had essentially made her survive the hard war years, had lived a good life, had not died in misery or serious sadness, but had a family and other human joys. It was hard to tell what one's feelings were in such a situation. Casey recalled once watching a vintage movie rare propaganda that had been made during the war or a little after. The hijack heroine was numbered and settled as a servant in the home of wealthy burghers who kept their own shop and actively believed in the ideals of the Reich. Much in this picture was too artificial. A fat and smug German with a military son who serves at the front and also believes in the ideals of the party. An arrogant daughter or daughter-in-law who also makes frequent appearances in the house and displays sadistic tendencies towards the maid. And of course, another captured Englishman is the proud lad who was brought into the house as an employee. And understandably, he represents not submission to the Germans. The agitation was done with quality and could well have been a classic of black and white cinema. If the industry hadn't moved so vigorously and the content hadn't inspired a negative contempt for all things German and European. The old lady revealed that Rocky had promised to take Tony to Germany, show him to a psychologist, and put him in a clinic to cure his alcoholism. He also said that the aunt who wanted so much to come to the UK had left a large sum of money for the trip and had willed that money to be invested and then given to her relatives if possible. It turned out that Lily and fell out a substantial part, except for what will go to her grandchildren, who were aunt's great-grandchildren, and she had no kin closer to her in the UK. It seems that the aunt who was taken away still thought about her land and her family all her life. She wanted to do at least something for them, but she could have left this world as a distant one, become the possessor of a new culture and connections. It's like Casey says, money to money. You've surprised me so much, and now you're doing it all at once. Who could have imagined? Yeah, Lily, how would you like to go to Germany? See how your aunt lived? I've seen it all. Casey, I've seen it all. I ain't got nothing else to see. I don't care if I go to Germany or to the market. It's all the same to me. How can it be the same? People there live different lives. Casey swept another portion of crab sticks into the salad bowl with a large knife. They do things differently, work differently. People are the same everywhere, baby, and their jobs are the same. The main thing to understand the whole world is to look at one person and see what he is doing and thinking about. The old woman spoke confidently, and it was obvious that she really, strange as it may seem, understood the world and saw a lot of things. Well, it is not good to sit in one city and look at others. It's all the same to me, but you don't sit, of course, go and have a look. Lily, how am I going to go? You can go like that. Casey remained silent and began to distract herself with thoughts about whether she should dress the rice for the crab salad with vinegar or leave it like that and only salt it. I go to the store and look at people and see so many things that words cannot express. I see how people walk and where they're going. I see what's on someone's mind, who lies to himself and who lies to others, who speaks the truth and lives in truth. But you don't meet such people very often. Lily almost for the first time grinned and waved her hand. But what's the use, you see? Tony has to put up with it every day anyway, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's not like you can chase him out into the street. And so the monster realizes that he's ruining himself and bothering me. What's the use? Realizing that you see the world doesn't make you smart, and no one pours you a soup for your understanding. Casey never ceased to be amazed at such shrewd thoughts of the old woman, and she didn't understand how such a thing could happen. Is it that when material problems are solved, everyone becomes a thinker and begins to tell all sorts of clever things, or Lily forever was like that, but only now she could calmly tell about her own experience, not thinking that her thoughts will not feed her and will not get rid of alcoholic terror, and having to run out and peddle apples every day, to freeze and know that these efforts will not lead to anything special. So we'll have to survive on a meager pension and worthless part-time jobs. Nanny called. Honey, do you have any money left? Go to the store, buy hard cheese, macaroni spiral peas and canned corn, juicy bell peppers. Spiralized macaroni salad was a specialty. She loved it, and so did Nani. The contrast of the tried and true pasta with juicy bell peppers and corn was complemented by the heartiness of diced cheese and strips of cheese smoked ham. Sometimes also thinly sliced, crispy, pickled gherkins and small chunks of olives. The sauce was made from oil and balsamic vinegar or soy sauce, but it was also possible to make homemade mayonnaise. The main thing was to make a rather fatty dressing, which will well emphasize the satiety of the salad, but at the same time reflect from the crunchy and fresh ingredients of corn, cucumbers, peppers, olives. But in fact, roughly realizing that she didn't wear house pants precisely when the possibility of crossing paths with Rocky in the kitchen was highest. On the other hand, Casey wanted a different kind of interest, not just animal consumer interest, but interest in herself. In other words, when she started seeing this kind of intimacy from a dad frequently, she wanted him to at least start courting her a little bit. How would we see the lake? From her laptop screen, the YouTube vlogger gestured vigorously. She spoke in a confident tone that disposes as if every viewer could easily walk into her home and tell her their problems. There are different perspectives on this. As you know, I have recently been initiated into Buddhism and use these teachings in my daily life. In Buddhism, they say that lakes are seen differently by different beings. Casey looked outside the window at the fall sky and tried to imagine a lake. The more watery divisions of gray clouds looked something like a row of lake surface, for example, in the drawing. Demonic beings. As you know, there are divine beings, demonic beings and humans in the world. I think I certainly came from the divine world to help other people gain awareness and harmony. The tan maiden flashed her white teeth, fixed her pink bangs with her right hand, thoughtfully looked from the screen, emphasizing the seriousness and at the same time self-irony of the words said, and continued to talk sweetly. So, demonic beings see the lake as unclean, not clean. I mean all sorts of puss and dirt and the rest of it, all sorts of nasty stuff. Casey tried to understand what was meant and listened thoughtfully, resting her knuckles against her cheekbones on each side. Human beings. I mean, like here we are. I mean, here's you and us and me, and generally all human beings see that, well, kind of like they lake and sea. Unless, of course, they've eaten fly agaric. By the way, my journey and the story of how I went to ayahuasca to the present. The damsel emphasized the word real and got a little eye rolling. Shaman to South America. See, on my already filmed blog you can click on the link. Right here on this link and see how I tasted the potions of the ancient Indians. Casey thought that somewhere behind the strange doors of this world some other perception exists, and people travel to another country not to see relatives or to study British culture, but to drink some strange concoctions. To socialize with strange people, shamans who perform their strange rituals literally right next to other people. After all, there are probably also people working in this jungle cutting down forests and doing something else. And right next door, strange Europeans come to look for things that can't be seen. A joyful picture is seen by the divine beings. To them, the lakes are nectar and healing and benevolent potions and stuff like that, Casey only realized that if you have enough money for a camera and promotion of the channel, there is an opportunity to start telling others about your life and make even more money. She liked this blogger in general though, liked the observations and some of the advice, her best friend style pitch. which made it feel like you were actually talking to a loved one while watching and getting a good vibe. It's about, continued the russet-haired, tanned blogger, that our perception determines our reality. Also remember that you need to see the beauty in everything, and then the world as if will become and you see beautiful. Like attracts like, you should treat others as you want to be treated. This is the golden rule of ethics. That is, in our example, we want others to see us as beautiful feminine attractiveness, attractive energy. So we also begin to treat everything as beautiful, you know? Casey pressed the space bar and began to stare at the sky and the space outside the window. Dusk was taking over the air, as if the spoiled light pie was starting to roll a bit around the perimeter, and there was a sense of some typical evening anxiety in some parts. Casey silently went to see what Nanny was doing. She came back into the kitchen, poured herself some cold carbonated mineral water, and wondered if the water in that glass was changing, depending on how she felt about it. Casey imagined that the water was sweet, and indeed began to taste a little sweeter. And I'm sweeter now. With a smile, she thought. Nevertheless, she wanted to try it. After all, they say that rich people choose a special contingent of socializing and try to look for the good in the world, and for this the world thanks them. Maybe it's the same with beauty. Casey wanted to see if Rocky's attitude would change. After all, it was definitely possible to say that confident and insecure people, as a rule, are treated differently. That is, something does change from one's inner attitude after all, so why not try it with attractiveness? Throughout the next day, Casey tried to treat others as beautiful. She noticed the calligraphic signatures on documents, noticed her boss's new shirt, and a little forced herself to think that he was nice in general. There were mixed feelings about the female staff, but Casey tried to keep her eyes on Lucy's lips. When the latter came in to tell her New World movie reviews, Casey also recently learned on the internet that if you look at a person's lips during a conversation, the person you are talking to will assume that you are interested in them. Whereas if you look between the eyebrows, the person will feel awkward or threatened. Although another time Casey saw the advice that you should look just in the eyebrows, so as not to embarrass the interlocutor and to make it clear that you maintain contact views. Either way, by the end of the day, small chips and cracks had accumulated in Lucy's eyebrows. And no matter how much Casey tried to see the beauty of antique ruins or tree bark in it, nothing of the kind could be seen, and the only association with the plaster in their hallway. The lips, meanwhile, offered more possibilities. Here Lucy corrected her makeup more often, and Casey enjoyed watching those curves of boardways move. Thought about the wine in her glass, the pink flowers, and generally tried to admire watching Lucy's lips. On the way to the bus, Casey tried to see other passers-by as beautiful. She didn't pick out any special details or make comparisons. Just thought about the fact that there was a beautiful person walking by. Of course, the thoughts were a bit overwhelming and didn't seem real. But Casey was diligent in developing that attitude, largely because she wanted the opportunity to be beautiful herself in exchange. Wanted to be looked at as beautiful too, or rather, that Rocky would look at her and invite her to go to a cafe or a movie in the evening. On the bus, Casey kept trying to see beauty in other people and in the entire cabin. It was difficult as the first slush of fall smeared across the floor. The faces were mostly tired and thoughtless. Many were on their way from work just for the drive. But Casey thought diligently about mindfulness and imagined that everything in front of her was actually beautiful. Even the ugly urchin who sat in the center of the cabin in the single seat and held on with a hand with a rectangular tattoo on the lower flanks of his fingers. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, Casey pondered, and tried to see something pleasant and austere in the convict's frightening appearance, some special variation of beauty. She pondered whether beauty was before her. And afterward, she cut off her thoughts to keep her concentration. And again, she recalled the blogger's story about different creatures. On her way off the bus, passing near the old ladies, she saw a flower on the dusty road. It was a little dirty with fall mud. Apparently, some of the old ladies selling flowers had thrown away one that couldn't be sold, or some customer had snatched the flower from the bouquet. Either way, Casey took a long look at exactly the flower on the ground, a little crumpled. Someone seemed to have stepped on it, not on purpose, but in passing. And now the flower, mixed with dirt, was lying on the surface, and Casey looked at it and tried to see the beauty. Hello to the broadcast news current to this hour. With her legs tucked up, Casey sat on the couch with a mug of cocoa, and the announcer spoke a standard phrase and went on to talk about how the world should be seen And what is the most important thing in this world? Are you watching the news? Standing in the park of the living room was Rocky, who had recently come in after working at the library and didn't go into the kitchen to eat dinner, but sat in his room. Casey hadn't expected to see him and squirmed her legs even more. Can I watch it with you? Rocky tried to show that he wasn't imposing, but he'd love to sit together, to take his mind off his work. Casey's tone was different now. Trying to contain their own glee, they made themselves comfortable on the couch and watched the evening news program, occasionally exchanging brief comments. They tried not to interfere with each other's watching, but they competed a little in the wit of their comments. They wanted to make each phrase more succinct and clever, to show their erudition, their understanding of the world and everything else. Casey was sure to make fun of some of the exaggeration of British propaganda. Rocky also tried to flaunt his understanding of the world agenda and use self-irony about Americans and Europeans. The two of them bantered on the subject of artificial separation. They joked about the layout of the news program, since they knew roughly how a sad story would be followed by a funny one, then would show something suspenseful and inspiring to end with a tasty dessert with candy ears or some funny contest or invention. Basically, something that is kind of relaxing as well. And also at the same time says that you don't have to worry particularly, and as such there are no problems. And the world is a nice story with funny animals. And it's well worth living for. Afterwards, they somehow quietly watched a movie after the news. Both of them knew the story, but they continued watching because the two of them were enjoying themselves, and they felt quite comfortable. After all, they had already lived and eaten next to each other for many days in a row. Rocky did funny impersonations of the main characters, or he was kind of voicing their phrases himself. Casey tried to help him a little in this to play female characters, but she did not do so well, so she did not often speak mostly, only resented some inconsistencies in the plot or strange details in the behavior of the characters. Nevertheless, it was still comfortable and kind of harmonious and beautiful. They didn't feel self-conscious or awkward, and it seemed like every joke in the world, every phrase said completely on point exactly when it should be said. That's how each of them felt. And after the viewing, Rocky brought Casey a glass of mineral water from the kitchen, for he knew that she put her water next to her at night so that she wouldn't have to go to the kitchen if she got thirsty. He brought the glass, wished her a good night's sleep, and left for his room. The hall seemed like an infinitely tall palace. The cinema was on the first floor, and there were escalators in the center to escalate pleasure and consumer appetite. Back to the new pavilion and store. The first floor also had a grocery hypermarket and small stores branded clothing or knickknacks of all sorts, as well as a wine boutique. So Manny stood close to a banner with a diagram of the floors of the mall, kicking out a little and cocking her head. The food court is on the fourth. We're going to the very top. Manny made an inviting hand gesture and walked toward the escalator. Rocky and Casey followed her. Nanny, like many teenagers in such situations, was in a state of some emotional exaltation. But at the same time she kept herself strictly serious and businesslike, as if they were not resting on a free day, but deciding and doing something very important. And very important characters who decide a lot of things. Nanny looked confident and pleased. Casey was in many ways glad of that. Glad of her reasonableness and her normal attitude toward Rocky, with whom they began to have a closer relationship. Not close, but just closer, friendly, as they say, platonic. Nevertheless, in the evenings they began to walk to cafes sometimes. On free days they went to the mall or took Nani somewhere else, and Rocky less often began to go on business trips for a few days. At the same time, he also correctly paid for rent and bought food for everyone, continuing sometimes to cook for himself separately. It ended up working out for everyone though, when the rest of them weren't a serious move, was what Rocky had arranged with Casey, to buy coffee, the car in half. Half was coming from his pay, and half was being given to Casey. Though, in fact, the money was from another down payment on the apartment. Casey liked that the coffee machine had the option of making cocoa, and Rocky had said the machine was all hers. But now he would also be using it, since he loves good bean coffee. "Will you buy me a coffee?" asked Nani, turning around to Rocky and Casey standing below. "It's not too early for you," said Casey. "It's not too late for coffee. You're already running like a propeller." "Actually, I'm not running. You're slowing down." Nani turned back and stood impatiently on the escalator. "Are you restricting her? You're not buying coffee?" asked Rocky. I'm not restricting her. She wants to look like an adult, so she wants to sit with a fancy coffee cup like the high school kids do. But then she gets all fussy at night. Why don't we go to a burger place and we won't want coffee? Rocky suggested it. I looked at the reviews here and they highly recommend the burger. Come on, I've hardly ever had a burger. I wanted to make them at home, but I don't understand how to bake the buns myself, and I don't want to buy them. It's really popular here. We used to always go to the burger shop after school with the guys, buy all sorts of goodies there and do our homework. Class, we go to the cafeteria. All right, so we're going to the burger place. Yeah, let's go. They started looking ahead of them, and when they got to the next floor, Casey noticed that the spacious hallway between the pavilions was being crossed by two guys, probably filming blogs or something. One of them had a smartphone on a stabilizer and was pointing it at other people. The guys filmed Casey, Nani, and Rocky as well. Casey didn't like it for some reason. One of them nodded at her and said, "Thank you." Casey began to ponder what blog she might be published on now, and thought about how in today's world you can always be filmed. We don't stress about that at all. It was like Rocky realized what Casey was thinking. If it's a touristy part of town, there's a lot of them. They're practically filming each other. Sometimes it's funny how they try not to cross paths so they don't shoot each other. In general, there are a lot of them on the streets everywhere. Passers-by are like a part of the landscape for them. They don't pay attention to who and when they are filming, and they are so important. It looks as if they are doing the most important work, but we don't pay attention to them. We have a mutual attitude. During the conversation, they went up another flight of stairs, stood in front of the burger house sign that Rocky had pointed out, and nodded to each other and went to sit down at the table. This is something magical. Casey clutched the burger she just bitten into with both hands, wearing the special gloves they gave out at the restaurant. "You have." Rocky held his burger with one hand and with the other moved the cardboard with pictures and prices from which he was reading to himself. "With pastrami. It's tender meat like that and brioche buns. Do you like it?" Rocky turned to a satisfied Nani. She nodded contentedly but said nothing and continued chewing, taking small bites from the large and oozing meal. Rocky looked like a contented burger with a family who had worked all week and had taken his loved ones out to enjoy a good meal and have fun. He looked somehow more grounded and serious, seemed not even as sophisticated as usual, but more casual. "Is it called dos vida?" He kept looking at the price list. "That's a good name. Try the sauce here, onions and apples." "Onions and apples? You've never had that? It's a popular sauce for sausages. Finely chopped onions are caramelized and add a grated apple or in a fine cut. Sometimes a little sugar is added. But as it is, there is enough sugars in them to make a nice and sweet sauce." "No." Casey ate contentedly and realized how the saliva was only arriving. And with each bite, the burger becomes even more delicious and satisfying. Casey. Standing at the entrance of the cafe was Lucy with her spouse and one of her children. She was waving and smiling actively, was much more smiley than she was at work. Casey waved at her burger and smiled further, continuing to smile in Rocky's direction. Lucy walked over and sat down at the table. "Let's get moving." Abruptly, she trilled in a sonorous voice, "So you can hear the nearest tables." "We're going to the movies. Thought we'd stop by. Have you been here before?" For the first time, Casey was unashamedly still biting and chewing, so she wasn't speaking clearly. She used her head to help her understand. "We were here last week. We stopped by. I wanted to tell you about it. But at night, you don't always want to tell me more, especially when there's nothing to chew on in the office." "Casey, I'm going to tell you something like that now." Lucy moved toward the desk as if there were no one else around. Casey delicately stopped eating and introduced the Cavaliers and the children to each other, and there was a rather awkward silence after the greeting. But Lucy paid no attention to it. She thought that companionship should come naturally to strangers as it did to her and Casey. "I don't want to seem like a glutton, but I'd eat you more, wouldn't you?" Casey looked at Nani, who immediately nodded in response. "Are you going to get us another one for two, or you want to go off together to pick out which one Nani likes?" Casey quite skillfully disbanded the awkward silence and allowed her company to leave the table and walk around the ordered counter without straining to look at the canvases with images of hamburgers, steaks, and price tags. "Anyway, you'll never guess where we were just now, will you?" "I was walking, and they were." Lucy nodded at her spouse and one of the kids. They were moral support. I decided to get my nose done after all. Lucy froze, waiting for a reaction from her companion. Casey just ate another piece of fries, sauteed with onions and apples. The flavor was really original and pleasant. Nose? That was a good question Casey asked. That's right, nose. Lucy pressed the tip of her nose with her index finger and flattened its surface a little. Just like Barry's. Ha ha! I don't mean nose like Barry's nose, but nose like Barry's nose in the story. Anyway, you get the idea. I'm going to have my nose decorated. I decided to add rhinestones. Right and lighting on the very tip, haha. Lucy was obviously enjoying her conversation and the prospect of a new nose. Tell me frankly, do you like it? Lucy turned around in profile, looked full face, bent over a little, as if giving a full view of her nose from every possible view and position. As a person, you're obviously attractive. Thank you, of course. But as the owner of such a schnoz, not so much. Lucy had what might be called an antique nose, straight with almost no nose bridge, rather thin and long. Certainly its size was larger than average, and in some ways too, it was possible to see that there were better proportions. Yet Lucy herself was ever so confident and attractive. It would be hard to suppose that she was complexed about her appearance, but as the conversation showed, complexed. Everyone strives for beauty, Casey thought, but didn't say it out loud. Anyway, we looked at the options. They have three-dimensional modeling there, so they literally show you what you look like in different versions. Lucy's spouse and child continued a long and somehow uncomfortable study of the price list, looking at the laminated cardboard, and the child sometimes poked a finger somewhere, and the father grumbled something in response. They looked through both sides several times, but they didn't choose anything. To be more precise, it was unclear whether they didn't choose anything and continued to study the assortment, or whether they were waiting for Lucy to finish talking and let them order something. Lucy paid absolutely no attention to them. Casey noticed the situation and made a joke about being able to see or not see beyond her nose, linked to Lucy's intention, but she understandably didn't talk about it. She even felt a little sorry for Lucy for some reason and began to ponder noses and beauty. At the same time, Casey was content and fed up, crumpled potatoes so pleasantly eaten after a tasty burger and washed down with a sour morsel of lingonberries that she didn't want to think, especially about all this. Casey only remembered that a person always sees his nose, but the consciousness processes the picture in such a way that the vision as if removes this part, and it seems that in front of you there is a flat screen on which life is shown. And only if you slant your eyes downwards or to the side, your nose becomes visible. However, that on a subconscious level, if she has always seen her nose, which she does not like, then subconsciously she could always be sad about it and have discontent, when it is necessary to hide such discontent from herself somehow, to hide from herself or to see in her room the divine nectar, or how the deities see the nose. Maybe in order to feel normal, it required incessantly deceiving oneself, not consciously, but somehow subconsciously suggesting that the nose is beautiful, thin and long. Although these disproportions are not liked, does Lucy's nose look like a flower in the dirt? Casey thought. Or is that a silly comparison at all, and such a thing is not worth comparing? Then what should it be compared to? And the flower in the dirt, is it her nose after the correction or before? Maybe the deities don't see the nose, but the flower. In their tandem, Lucy was used to peddling the conversation and could keep talking almost the whole distance. If she saw that Casey was listening to her, and Casey was listening and eating delicious potatoes with gravy, occasionally glancing back and forth between her own and Lucy's company. You know, I never liked him, and those nostrils. Lucy pressed the tip of her nose with her index finger again. It doesn't connect with me all the way I'd like it to look. It's very popular, and now a lot of people do for aesthetics. If you have the opportunity, why not take it? There's nothing wrong with you as it is. Casey said seriously. It might be fine for you, but I want to look the way I want to look, and I can look the way I want to look without you realizing it. The only thing I do understand is that you should order the same burger with a brioche bun. Yeah, I tried that the last time. Don't mess with me. I've made up my mind. It's up to you. All I'm saying is I drooled all over the table. I want to try to make something like this myself. Well, I'm not trying to talk me out of it. Everyone can claim something beautiful, like a beautiful relationship. Lucy turned around on the bench toward the order counter and looked for Nani and Rocky, who were still walking along the counter and talking to each other quite nicely. Rocky was looming over her with his head bowed majestically and in his suit, looking like a fashionable man who leads trainings on how to make money or walks around looking important and chatting on the phone in the lobby of a business center. Casey never ceased to be amazed at this striking change in his image, which had become much more organic to the space of shopping and business centers. When he writes his research, or was he going to do his dissertation here? Lucy didn't know how and didn't want to make vulgar hints, and this time she hadn't succeeded in hinting about Casey and Rocky's relationship either. Still, she looked at Casey cheerfully. A few more weeks, I guess. So, it's been almost a quarter of a year here. Casey replied thoughtfully, I wish they had the recipe for these burgers. I'm grinding the ground meat in the meat grinder for the second time. Casey looked out the kitchen window. There were washed vegetables and salad on the table. It smelled delicious with the fresh dressing she'd substituted just recently from vinegar, pickles, hot peppers, sugar, and salt. She pondered whether to add mustard. The buns were grilling and changing color slightly around the edges. Also, the day was brightening with dusk as if around the edges. Casey pushed away her usual evening anxiety and longing. She began to gaze out into the distance at the city panorama of rugged, huge grid streets. To give the burger extra flavor, she used homemade mayonnaise, which she carefully smeared with a kitchen brush over the surfaces of the bun halves fresh off the grill. Now she should have chosen a piece of fresh lettuce, but she didn't like that option. And it always seemed that if the burger is eaten, it is quite appropriate to put a slice of tomato right on the bun with sauce, and only after that to give fresh lettuce. That way, the tomato becomes sandwiched between the harder and toasted bun and the crunchy lettuce. The result is an extra texture that doesn't feel like another curious contrast. Casey cut a few tomato slices sharply and enjoyed the fact that store-bought tomatoes are so uniform and so collapsible, as if specially grown for the size of the burgers. The spreadable sauce squirted a little on the surface of the warmed buns and began to spread into the surface. Casey liked that the buns would soak up the rather oily sauce well, and the fresh tomato on top would give a little soreness, and the sauce wouldn't seem so greasy. After that, she put a piece of lettuce on top and thought she would still have time for coffee before Rocky got there. She looked at the coffee machine and thought she would make herself a nice mocha. Cocoa was completely unnecessary at this point. On top of the crisp lettuce, of course, the burger itself would need to be put on top. Casey molded a couple of burgers out of the freshly handmade stuffing, wet her hand a little beforehand, put them on the heated pan, and pressed them down with a spatula. After waiting a bit, she flipped the meat over and pressed down again. She would be putting several layers in these burgers, so she should make the burgers thin enough so they wouldn't fall apart in her hands and were comfortable to hold. Now she put a slice of cheese on each one to spread on the surface, and after waiting a bit, she took the burgers right off onto the lettuce, and then molded a few more and put them on the heated skillet. Between the layers of burgers and cheese, she put pieces of pepperoni, sometimes smearing the surface of the cheese, sauce with vinegar and cucumber. Eventually, there were several layers, on top of which she should have put some fried sauerkraut with apples and onions. Rocky loved that sweet addition, and Casey now almost always tried to use that combination in her meals, in her burgers at least. The second part of the bun needed to be smeared with a mixture of mustard and ketchup and pressed on top of the onion and cabbage caramelized mixture. "Hello on the air, the news current to this hour," said the announcer of a German television station. Casey turned to the TV in the kitchen and waited for the announcement of the stories. After that, she turned on the coffee maker and waited for her drink. After watching the news, which she used to build up her vocabulary and find new topics to talk about with Rocky in the evening, she went over to Nani's house to check her German crib sheets, give her spelling tips, and help her spell her commas.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.